What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Yours Truly podcast, a place we go to practice conversation craft as we think out loud together. Today, I'm honored to have Spec in One, Aidan Thornbury, in the Yours Truly virtual studio. There's an unbroken thread related to me becoming a person on YouTube and the cultural happenings around public discourse and debate between Christianity and New Atheism. I've said many times that I have a core memory from the summer of 2009, seeing Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, prominently displayed in a Barnes & Noble in Panama City, Florida, the summer I worked there as an evangelical worship leader for a large church camp organization. And it shook me. Am I delusional for believing in God, giving my whole life to this endeavor to lead people to worship said God? It was at this time I began watching every debate I could between Christian apologists and new atheist evangelists on YouTube. And though I was never ultimately convinced by the arguments either way, I knew I didn't want to turn into whatever the new atheism had to offer. But at the same time, I felt like I was on the losing side of a war of ideas, and would spend the next decade in a state of epistemological insecurity. But then in the fall of 2016, I saw an interview of this Canadian psychologist going head-to-head with a British journalist about the ever-widening cultural and political divide happening. And that video led me to listening to hours of this man talking about evolution, meaning, God, and the Bible in a way I had never heard synthesized. It unlocked something in me and in the culture that had not yet happened in the discourse previously. And shockingly, this Canadian psychologist began having conversations with the new atheist, most notably Sam Harris. Let me emphasize conversation. The infamously disastrous Pain Burn series, though ultimately a financial failure, captured a drastic change in culture and discourse surrounding religious mythos and belief and atheistic scientism. A new form of discourse emerged. We watched the abstracted war of ideas and debate begin to evolve in dialectic discourse, with Brett Weinstein's mimetic idea of steel manning, an old form of reasoning bubbled up from the pre-modern Socratic dialect. You can see one of my early videos entitled How 3-Hour Conversations Changed the World. This all happening when podcasts really began to become mainstream. Fast forward to today, podcasts are now the preferred method of understanding people, celebrities, politicians, and even randos across the internet. A lot has happened since those early days. The intellectual dark web and Peterson's journey has had its ups and downs, but he's settled into a certain type of content creator with Peterson Academy and work at the Daily Wire. Richard Dawkins is finishing up his farewell lecture tour in the States. He has had his own legacy tainted by the intensities of the very war Peterson took head on back in 2016. 8 years after Peterson's rise to fame and Dawkins's wane from prominence, they took the time, while Dawkins was stateside, to take another stab at furthering the conversation between fact and mythos, symbol and theory. I spent a lot of time painting this picture today because the conversation between these two men represents something deep within the certain cultural consciousness and inspired me to make my first response video on YouTube. And it also inspired my guest today to make a similar response video to the Dawkins-Peterson conversation. This being his first video on an old YouTube channel in 5 years, a channel where his initial video was a response to Jordan Peterson's interview with Kathy Newman on Channel 4, as mentioned earlier. As I watched Aidan's response, I couldn't help but relate. He mentioned several similar connection points that we'll cover today. He also was so intensely moved by the conversation that he recorded it over 3 hours at 3 o'clock in the morning. I can't wait to take some time to get to know Aidan today with you all and learn about why this conversation meant so much to him. The arguments have never been just about facts and logic. They have always been about something deeper, something true. So sit back, clock in, start some chores, take the kid on a stroll, hit the road, and join Aidan and I as we practice some conversation craft here today on the Yours Truly podcast. And as always, give the video a like and subscribe. Today, I'll be starting out the conversation with a clip from Aidan's video. So without further delay, I give you Aidan Thornbury, Spec in One. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.
This is the climax of the conversation, because this is the point where Peterson has finally gotten Dawkins to a position where he is willing to accept the possibility of the truth of story within the scientific literature, within the scientific understanding of his worldview. And then they start to have a back and forth where they're actually starting to engage with each other to a point where they're starting to bring different ideas to the conversation to kind of support the conversation. Peterson is finding new ways to essentially convey what he's been trying to convey the whole time. And then Dawkins is bringing in new ideas with, primates standing on their hind legs, specifically being another example of the exact thing that they're trying to discuss at the moment. And it's beautiful to me because it is a prime example of, I think, something I'm bad at, which is sometimes forgetting that not everybody is always interested in the world in the exact same way that you view it. And even though you may absolutely love everything that you see about the world and the way you see it, you have to recognize that other people don't always see it the way you do. And the key is that if you feel you have something important that you have to say, you have to recognize, how is this person that I'm speaking to right now going to hear this? Are they going to be interested in hearing what I have to say? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you think you have something to say. Ironic, considering the situation we're currently in. What matters specifically is whether or not the person you're talking to wants to hear what you're saying. And sometimes whether or not they want to hear what you're saying isn't what you're saying, it's how you're saying it. And I think this is a beautiful example of that. This is an example at the highest level of two people coming from two completely different worlds, coming together, and over the course of an hour and a half, finally finding common ground, not only in the sense of agreeing on something, but finding a way to communicate with each other in a productive way that I hope will then lead to more communication, and that they will actually be able to come back to this conversation. Dawkins having read what Jordan Peterson was discussing, even if he doesn't agree with any of the claims that Peterson was talking about. The key would be that they were able to get each other to a mutual position of respect and desire to continue a conversation about something that initially they both essentially were on opposing sides of.
Well, that was Aidan on your Speckin' One YouTube channel, from the video that I stumbled across, some other people I stumbled across, and I decided to kind of reach out, from you reaching out, and find ourselves here. So thanks for coming on today, man.
Hey, Christian, thanks so much for having me, genuinely. I was not anticipating, coming onto other podcasts or anything as a result of that video. Honestly, considering when I recorded it and the speed with which I got it kind of edited and put up there, I was kind of expecting that it would just kind of go under the radar, especially because, the main reason that I stopped on that YouTube channel was because I was in college at the time when that channel started. And that first video back was 6 years ago when I made it. Whoever controls Peterson's Twitter account, or at least did at that time, tweeted it out.
Oh,
And and I was like, and so I saw the tweet, and then it got 20 some thousand views. And I was in school for film at the time, and I was like, I'm not ready for this. Getting publicity in this side of the internet while being in film school is not going to mix well. I really am flattered, but I'm 19 years old. I'm not ready for this.
wow.
But so because the way that channel started was such a fluke, I just kind of had a feeling that, anything else that I did on it would kind of go under the radar. And I'm glad to see that that's not the case. I'm glad to see that my rambling at 3 o'clock in the morning until 5 actually was, interesting and productive enough to, engage people, both yourself and the people who were in the comments. But yeah, honestly, I'm just grateful that anything I said was inspiring enough in any way, shape, or form to actually have a conversation. So thank you for having me here.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, I think that's, to me, the interesting thing is, I mean, I had a similar response to the video. I felt like I wanted to get on and say something about it. Of course, I've been trying to do this YouTube game a little bit over the past year, but you go from you kind of painted a little bit of why you kind of went radio silent on the channel because of school and what it was attached to. But why did it feel like now was what was the point of you getting back on that old channel, and why was it so intense for you to do what you did at 3 a.m? That's interesting.
So there's a little bit of context there. So if you notice that in the background, that's from another channel that I run the production side of. It's called The Lore Lodge, and my buddy and I kind of started that on a whim right after college because he was working in marketing, specifically like building marketing, like whatever. I can't remember what it was. It was for like apartments for students or whatever. He hated it. He went to school for history, and I had gone to school for film, and I couldn't get a job in anything. I was working on a farm at the time because COVID was happening and all that fun stuff. Um, and he had a TikTok go viral, and we were getting ready to go out that night when it happened. And he like doubled. He had like 600 followers on TikTok, and it doubled to like 1,200 inside of an hour. And even that early on, he just looked at me before we even left his apartment. And he was like, "We have to turn this into something." And I was like, "All right, cool, deal." And 3 years later, that's our day job. I was able to quit my day job back at the beginning of this past year. He quit his day job 2 years ago, and we've kind of turned that into something. We've got another channel that we're slowly growing with. It's called The Weird Bible, where we discuss weird Bible passages. We actually have Wendigoon comes on and joins us for that when he has time. But so I think the reason, so that's important context because I've been in a position where now I've got 3 years of YouTube under my belt in a different context where I'm not the person in front of the camera most of the time. We have a podcast that we do once a week, but it's much smaller than the main stuff. And we'd initially, because I wasn't using the channel Specian, because it was originally called From A to Gen Z. And because I wasn't using it, and we were like, all right, well, we need secondary channels for other stuff that we're going to put on. We turned that into a secondary channel for the main channel, the Lore Lodge, and we never did anything with it. And so a few months ago, I was starting to get the itch. I was like, all right, because I had a couple people, Wendigoon and a couple other content creators that we had, done collaborations with. They were like, why do you not have your own channel about stuff? And I was like, the time, like, we do a video a week and, it's a lot of editing and, a lot of research and stuff. I don't do any of the research. That's my other buddy. But everybody was like, yeah, but you should do something. It'll be worthwhile for you to do something. And it just kind of felt like it was back in college where people were motivating me to do it, even though I was kind of like nervous about it. And honestly, a lot of it came from fear of, I still want to make movies at some point. Among other things. And, I've just worried for a decade or more that it's like, well, if I have differentiating opinions from the majority of the people in the production, industry, I'm never going to get a job. And I think now the world's starting to shift a little bit in a way that I hope is a little more accepting of different ideas. And I don't think I have anything crazy in my head. I'm pretty much dead center nowadays. But so essentially this all experience with YouTube made me a lot more comfortable, A, in front of a camera, and B, just with my own ideas, discussing with a lot of different people. And then we never did anything with the channel. So a couple months ago, I was like, hey, if we're not going to do anything with this, why don't we transfer this idea, if we ever do anything, to a different email, and then I'll start, I'll convert this channel back to what I had it as. And I turned it from A to Gen Z to Specian just because I wanted something different. I wanted something that was a little bit more in the realm of nomenclature for me, rather than like as a stage name, rather than like a channel name. But yeah, so that's the foundation of where it ended up. It was like it was ready to go. It just needed a catalyst, essentially. And I didn't think that internally, but I realized looking back now, it's like, all right, I had set the stage for something to happen. And then the Peterson Dawkins video came out. And the reason that specific video is the thing that sent me over the edge was because, and I explained a little bit in the video, but not in depth. So when I was young, very young, I was raised Catholic, and like I don't remember a lot of it, but I prayed every night, and I was like very, very devout. And then the thing that took me away from it. So when I was 6 to 8, somewhere around that realm, my dad's sister, her name was Karen. She became like my best friend. I was over her place like almost every weekend, it seemed, in my head, just because like she was like a kid in a middle-aged woman's body. You know, she was always taking me like to fun places. She was teaching me about like how to bake. She let me just like mow her lawn at like 6, and like everybody would be like, why are you letting this child like, you know, repaint your house and like, you know, handle machinery? And meanwhile to me, I'm like, this is amazing. Like, you know, this is the wonderland essentially. And she taught me a lot of lessons, like never go anywhere empty handed. Not that I followed that greatly, but you know, I tried to. And you know, it was just, she became like my best friend. And then she was diagnosed with cancer. And unfortunately, looking back, she knew about it a lot earlier than she let on, and she'd kind of come back to kind of say her goodbyes because she knew there was nothing that could be done about it. But she went from the most vivacious person I had ever encountered to basically a walking corpse. And you know, that was hard for me. And then of course she passed, and I think I just kind of like shut it out of my brain because I in my young youthful mind I blamed God for that.
Yeah.
And so I went full atheism, and I started like binge watching in middle school Dawkins, Hitchens. I don't remember if Harris was around that early on or if he had much of a presence, but like Hitchens was my guy. You know, I watched so many Hitch slap compilations, it's not even funny. But and then so that lasted until high school, and then I was having some conversations with some people, and it got to the point where like they were asking me questions I didn't know the answer to. And I was like, well, where are you getting these ideas? Where are you getting these like these facts or whatever that like I have no idea what you're talking about? And they pointed me to a few people, and that led me down the rabbit hole to where I found Peterson. And I was really captivated by his Maps of Meaning lectures and his Genesis lectures. And you know, I wasn't really that interested in the political stuff because to me that was too momentary, and it was too divisive. Not that he himself was being divisive, but that the world around it was just too excessively divisive. But I really enjoyed, because you know, at that point in high school, I had decided I want to do filmmaking as my profession. And the reason I decided that was because it was something that I'd been interested in all my life. And the thing is, I had other interests. Like I went into high school thinking I was going to do aeronautical engineering, but then as it went on, you know, I took more filmmaking classes, and I kind of sat myself down and had an internal conversation in junior year of high school. And I was like, all right, well, what are all of my interests? And I put the whole list down. I was like, all right, these are too many, and I'm interested in too many of these to want to pick any individual one as a career. What's the career that would allow me to explore these interests as much as possible? Filmmaking. And it was natural because that was one of the highest interest levels anyway. So I was like, all right, cool. Logically, this all makes sense. And so because I was interested in filmmaking and storytelling, his idea of like the mythology kind of, you know, transferring throughout, you know, millennia of human history and human story really resonated with me. And obviously, like I had been studying, not studying as much as I had been recently, but like interested in the ideas of Joseph Campbell, especially considering, you know, when I learned of his teachings through, you know, finding out that that's essentially the entirety of what Lucas based Star Wars off of. And so did the deep dive with that, was really into that rabbit hole up until college where I made that video. And then, you know, as most people with ADHD would tell you, the hyperfixation slowed down, and you know, my life moved on to other things. And then, you know, we enter the various other rabbit holes we find, leading us then again to last week. I think it was last week,
Yeah.
where you know that video comes out, and so I see the video, and I'm like, all right, I know they've been talking about having a conversation for a
Right.
while, but you know, seeing them sitting together, it was like, oh, this is two halves of my brain having a debate. And I was like, you know, just because of the personal relationship I had with, you know, both of them as public figures in terms of how my brain developed over time, it really, like, there was definitely an emotional charge there. And it was also, you know, an intellectual charge in the sense of like, all right, well, I've followed both of these guys very in depth at different periods of my life.
Mhm.
And I don't assume or presume to be right about almost anything that I say on the majority of times. So I'm going to do an entire appeal to authority and see which one of these guys comes out on top. So that way I can know which side of my brain has actually got a little bit more clarity. And I'm being very hyperbolic there, but
Sure.
but that was the thing. It was like, you know, all right, so I've got the logic side, I've got the mythological side. Where's this going to go? And then upon watching the video, it led me to the conclusion, which was the clip that you just played at the beginning of this, which is like, oh, this is, you go in and you're hopeful for a good conversation, but especially in this kind of scenario, having known, especially Dawkins's history with, people who were on the side of theism and especially the way he started the conversation, I think he was anticipating the typical religious arguments. And, you go in, it's like, all right, this is going to be a debate or whatever. And then just seeing Peterson routinely attempt to essentially and the reason I called it a, plea to God disguised as debate is because, again, a little bit hyperbolic, but he's really just trying to get him to read a book. And that was the most interesting part of the whole conversation, is that this is an hour and a half of Jordan Peterson trying to get somebody to read a book. And it's amazing how long it takes, even though he starts out with his thesis statement of that, it takes an hour and a half to get Dawkins even willing to entertain the idea. And it's amazing the amount of mental gymnastics they both have to go to find that common ground. But, the patience that Peterson showed to be able to get him there. And, obviously, like, I don't agree with Peterson on everything that he says. And, I don't disagree with, everything that Dawkins says. I think that the keystone of that whole conversation is I agree that there must be at some point some overlap between science and mythology. There will be at some point, unless this is our Tower of Babel, and essentially the attempt to unify these two is essentially what's going to lead to that element of history or mythology repeating itself. But assuming the optimistic side that we can actually get there without interference, I think that really is possible. And I think anybody who's not interested in doing that, I think if they also say that they're interested in solving the questions of the universe, is being a bit hypocritical. So that was one of the annoyances I had with Dawkins there, considering he just routinely said he's not interested by these things. And it's like, I thought the point of Peterson saying the reason you're not is because you've had them so, firmly founded your entire life that you've never had to question it. You've been able to focus purely on science. I think that's a really good point. And I hope that conversation made him more open and willing to, explore that a little bit and see if there really is any overlap. But I've talked way too much at this point, so please.
Well, I'm glad, you got your coffee going. It's
Yeah.
kind of early and it's okay. Cause I'm hosting you. I want to know more of you, and people that follow along with me, they know a lot of my stuff, but for sake of conversation, I'll try to meet you at some of this stuff, where you're talking. I shared a little bit in the intro, where I've come from. I didn't really mention this, but I haven't been doing like Christian ministry for like 7 or 8 years. Still a Christian, but that I had some fallout in my life. And so that's not been a part of it. But this journey of this kind of intellectual journey, this journey of, faith and myth and logic and reason, like you're saying, I do think that the conversation, Peterson changed that conversation almost single-handedly. Because if you were watching all those debates, the hitch slap, everything, Dawkins, whoever, Christian apologists, I think, and to back it up even a little further, that problem of pain, that problem of evil, of unjust in the world, like that's an obvious reason why many people struggle with theism. Like, I'm not going to try to argue that. I just want to meet you there and acknowledge that makes sense. And it's, so it's interesting, getting into high school. And I think that one of the interesting things, there's this kind of feisty character on YouTube called Redeemed Zoomer, who's been, I don't know if you've watched any of his content.
I've not, no.
He became he talks about being an atheist in high school. He was from New York State. And then he's like a kind of a Christian Zoomer guy, the way he does stuff. But the reason I bring him in is because I'm hearing, like, even from you, because how old are you right now?
26.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm about to be 40. And so
no way.
What's so interesting is what younger people are going through as a result of the internet, the amount of ideas, the amount of philosophy, and the amount of worldview, like, intensity that you guys have experienced in the course of a decade is tremendous. that's something that I think that isn't quite well understood maybe in the public consciousness, because you're kind of repeating like, well, I was an atheist I became an atheist at 8, and the next decade I kind of found some kind of semblance of reconciliation with the religious ideas, and like and that's kind of wild to me, but that's not unheard of, I don't think. And so anyways, I think that's interesting. And I do think that conversation, like I had a pretty intense response to be like, I want to talk about this as a response, oh, I could make a response video, and if I do it quick, it's going to get some clicks too. But at the same time, it's also tapping on something that has been deeply meaningful in my life. And I feel like that was true for you. That's came across for me that, there's the other dynamics. You obviously have a plaque on your wall. Like those are all real things too. But there's also the part about if this is an artistic endeavor, something I've been doing. It was so interesting as you were talking. I've been doing a YouTube series on creativity for the last 4 or 5 conversations. And I really struggled with understanding, even as a musician, what it meant to be creative, because I was doing all this like copying Christian songs, all that. I was just like, I'm just covering things or whatever. And I think that the thing that, you were talking about, is it as polished and can it be all, and like what you the conversation that you are reaching out with through a type of artistic endeavor was raw enough and true enough that I think it had resonance in a way that a person that was receiving that, like myself, responded to it. And so there's a lot of things going on with YouTube and the fact that the Peterson phenomenon took place basically on YouTube. Like that's where, so this is like a space where this thing has been happening. And I don't know. One thing I was kind of curious was, have you paid attention to some of the other players in this kind of meaning space around Peterson, like Jonathan Peugeot or John Vervaeke? Have you ever come across those guys?
So I hear when I listen to Peterson, because I just got back into this kind of space recently, because I've been honestly exploring other areas just out of curiosity, and like without like totally out of the philosophical lens. And so I've heard them referenced a lot. I still have yet to. I've got a stack of books in my bedroom that I need to go through. One thing I'm thinking about doing with the channel that I've resurrected now is essentially just because one of the things I see a lot is, people like Peterson or some of even the younger guys like O'Connor and Williams and a lot of these other people will reference like Hume or Aristotle or Descartes or Nietzsche, obviously, and all these different people. And that they clearly have studied these individuals. And I'm in a position where it's like, well, I took a philosophy course in college. And I've got a lot of the books. I've just never made the time effectively to read them. So I was thinking, well, I wonder how many people are also in the position where they hear people reference these individuals a lot, but they've never really had the opportunity to do the legwork. And it's like, well, what if I turn my legwork into something that other people then can watch and digest as well? So I'm thinking about doing that. I'm thinking about going through the backlog and just being like, all right, well, just to prove I've done it, I'm going to make a bunch of videos about having done it, and hopefully you'll be able to learn from it as well. So that's a long answer to say no, unfortunately, not yet.
Okay. Well, I mean, but it's just interesting to me. I mean, it's pointing you in that direction, but and it makes sense. I mean, if we're in this weird state, which you already know this, you've been doing, I guess you said like 3 years of YouTube
so far
and social media, pretty like obviously successfully. And that there's this way that you can turn your intellectual curiosities or your journey or, just the desire, like for me to have conversations with people about this stuff into something that other people want, content of that whole idea. But at the same time, if you can stay kind of like in the certain part of you, that's like, this is coming from like a genuine place, like a curious place, and is a mutually beneficial. I actually just watched a philosophical it was like a 30 or 40-minute video that was like the story of philosophy. And it went through this guy, you know, I think he's a philosophy teacher, and he kind of went through and compressed a lot of that stuff. And it was really good. I actually pulled out a pen and paper. First time I've done that since I went back to school, and like took notes on what he was talking about, because I too have had the similar, like, I want a better grasp. My first undergrad was philosophy and religion, you know, from a theological studies. And so I took a philosophy class and ethics class, but like, you know, that's a long time ago for me. And so I've been kind of wanting that very thing that you're talking about. So, you know, it's out there somewhere right here. But this is, I'm kind of part of this there's like a scene on the internet called This Little Corner, and it is kind of downstream from the Peterson, I call it like the Peterson cultural phenomenon. And there's a guy, he was a Christian pastor named Paul Vanderklay. And I don't know if you ever came across his videos on YouTube during the early Peterson stuff, but he was doing a lot of synthesis, you know, because when as a guy that was still kind of in like the evangelical world, would mention Peterson early on, people would say, oh, isn't he like the pastor, like heretical, that Genesis stuff? Like, and so I was like, oh, I can't even talk to anybody about this. But he was a Christian guy doing that. And there's been a lot of people kind of start channels around it. And there's like some YouTube dialogue and discourse around some of this stuff. But I think that the Peterson thing, it was so seminal. And so I wanted to, you've kind of answered the question on like why the 5-year break and why this was important coming back. But obviously with the stuff we talked about when you were a kid, that kind of pain, what were some of those questions from that in high school that kind of, I don't know, softened you towards a little bit a more broad view of intellectual reality? What were some of those finer points, if you don't mind sharing?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it really came down to, ironically enough, it was more of the political side. It was because I was extremely liberal in high school for the majority of it. And then some people were asking me questions about things that I didn't have a good answer to because, you know, I was consuming all liberal media. And then I realized it's like, oh, he gave me people names. I think one might have been Peterson. I think, ironically enough, one was Milo Yiannopoulos, and I was like, "Who's that guy?" And of course, that led down a very interesting rabbit hole. But it was an instance in which I was blinded to the fact that there was another side, in a sense of like I didn't even really think about it because I'm a early teenager. You know, I'm consuming what I know, which is ironic because I grew up in a quiet conservative household. My mom was a lifelong Democrat, but as time went on, the parties changed. She found herself on the other side of the divide. And my dad has never really been one for politics, but you know, he's a fiscal conservative, and that's about it. Everything else he doesn't really care about. Which fair enough. But so then I went deep down that rabbit hole, and it was really, it's when I found out that I was on a pendulum and that it was on the full other, one side, and then it swung completely the other way. And then once I kind of had absorbed everything on that side, it was like, as I then started to grow up knowing both sides, then I was able to actually parse out what I didn't agree with. It's like I had to go to both places to know where I as a person actually was. And it turns out every political compass test I take puts me pretty much dead center. And, so it was that. It was truly like, and unfortunately, I can't remember the specific questions, but it was essentially some political elements from the, 2015 leading into the 2016 election. And my buddy, and I literally said to the guy, I was like, I've never heard any of these things. Where are you hearing them? Like, where do you get this stuff? And, he gave me the names I mentioned, and I just dove right in, and I was like,
and I guess that was why that Peterson Kathy Newman video, I mean, that makes sense why that resonated with you in that way, because that was kind of so stark. It was so incredibly stark what was going on, and it needed to happen. There needed to be kind of a shakeup to where the public discourse could be freed up. But it can't.
Well,
go ahead.
I was just saying, what's funny about that video in particular is the main genesis for that video was less the politics and more because my other major in college was journalism, because my parents were like, we love you so much, we want to support you with film, but you're doing journalism. And I was like, but I don't want to. And my mom was like, you're doing it. So it's like we love you, but you're doing a backup plan. I was like, fair enough. But when that video came out, I was in year 2 of studying journalism, and I watched it as a journalism student. And I I was in the middle of a journalism class with oh God, I can't remember my professor's name. She was like the epitome of every stereotypical editor-in-chief, hard ass that you've ever seen. And like Perry White in Superman, just like she was exactly the stereotype you'd imagine. And it's so funny because she'd be that way in class, and like she would rip me to shreds in front of everybody about how I wrote my stuff. And then I'd go to her office and be like, like, how do I do this, whatever, better? And she's like, oh, you're doing fine. I'm like, what? And she's like, no. Like, you're all right. But like, there's a couple things you could do here and there. And I'm like, why are you like this in class? You're like, because that's the real world, honey. Like, you got to get ready for that. And I was like, you know what? Fair enough. I appreciate it. You're giving me thicker skin. It's great. But I'm learning all of these very specific things. Like we ripped apart the New York Times every class. And it was the New York Times, the Washington Post, and there was one other one. I think we did like Metro or something like that was smaller. And we'd rip all 3 of them apart at the beginning of every lecture. And essentially her point was, we know New York Times leans slightly left. This was back in college. It's probably a little more now. And we know the Washington Post, the New York Post leans right. Parse these out, look at the style, look at how they're writing these things, and look at it from a technical perspective. Which one is writing the story better? Which one is communicating it well? The New York Post is a little bit more of a tabloid, but look at how they're able to hook you with that headline. And, and that's the thing is, like, I don't know her political stance because she was so, you had no idea. It was all technical. It was like, it doesn't matter what the politics of the writer is. What matters is it more effective at grabbing readers? Are you getting the information in the top 2 paragraphs? And she said it was like New York Times fits AP style way better throughout their writing, but they could never beat New York Post in a headline, because New York Post is always going to grab people because they have that tabloid thing that, they're willing to go further. And so then watching the Kathy Newman video, I was looking at it, I was like, this is not journalism. Like, I may not be an active journalist, but I'm learning from some of the best right now, at least from what I can see. And this is not like, this is primetime BBC. And this is not even close to anything I'm learning.
Wow.
Why is that the case? And the nugget for that video for me was like, I think that the biggest thing here is that we need to really take a step back and analyze, like, are we really doing journalism anymore? And should we acknowledge that, in the sense of like, is it important to notice and, I don't know, I guess, digest the fact that like the I was going to say the field goals have shifted, the goalposts have shifted. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah. So, and that's the thing is like, it's amazing how much has changed. And, obviously I'm young enough to not remember a lot of things in history. I've learned a lot of it, but I wasn't there for it. But another thing I just watched, a couple weeks back, was the thing about the Gore Bush election. And there's a great channel called Climate Town, and they run through a lot of really interesting things about stuff that you would never expect about how business essentially screws people over, but also how sometimes, like, the opposite occurs, where a business does something great, but then they are screwed over. And it's interesting. But like, we have all this talk about election fraud right now, and it's like, when you learn the details of the Gore Bush election, you're like, oh no, this stuff has been happening forever. It's just now we all know about it. And it's amazing how much that's true across the board.
Yeah, it's one thing, and that's the interesting thing. It's one thing that if you're the kind of upper class guy that reads the newspaper every day versus the working person that just kicks up and clocks in at 6 a.m. in the morning, they were more informed. The elite was more, to a degree, more informed or more controlled through those mechanisms, and the mass populace wasn't even really that engaged because they weren't like reading the op-eds and whatever, And then when that got democratized, you know, it's we're still trying to figure that out. Obviously, it's very messy, but I mean, that's a fascinating insight for the Kathy Newman interview about coming from it as a journalist versus necessarily not only from a like cultural political perspective, um, that it fascinated you and kind of unlocked, I guess, like a perspective, you know, a perspective of how bias works in our has been working in our society. Um, I think that is fascinating because to have that journalistic perspective on it. Mine was more from the kind of basically the cultural political side, that feeling the tensions. And obviously I'm older, so I was like I was a little older than you even whenever that was going on, which I guess that's kind of another question. I didn't know exactly how old you were making the video and everything, but what is your kind of outlook? Do you have a positive or optimistic outlook, or do you have or is it more pessimistic on you know, Western civilization or culture or United States or whatever?
That's an interesting question because I think parsing out the conversations I've had with people in the last year, I have a nihilistic view about humans as a species, but I have an optimistic view about where we're going. I think, and it's funny because that's the opposite of a lot of people I know, and in particular my girlfriend. She is a very optimistic about humans as a species, but pessimistic about where we're going. So we have very interesting conversations whenever we're capable of having them. But yeah, one of the books that I read years ago was on the recommendation of Peterson, was the Panzram book, because I've always been interested in, similar to him even before I learned of him, was, you know, this underlying maliciousness that can exist in humans, because I took some psychology courses in high school, again before I'd known of him, because my mom has her master's in it, and so I grew up, you know, in middle school she was getting her master's in psychology, so I grew up around it. I was always interested in it. And one of the things that really fascinated me was, in particular, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold from Columbine. And we were going through a psychology course in my junior year, and in addition to that, because we were learning about some different, you know, mental disorders, and I think there had just been another mass shooting in a school. It was after Sandy Hook. It might have been the Orlando, the nightclub one. And it just made me think about the fact it's like, all right, where did this all really start? And obviously, you know, in terms of the modern
Psyche.
the modern psyche, it started with Columbine in '99. And I don't know if the site is still available, but there's a site with both of their journals. And I went through their journals with a fine-tooth comb because I was like, all right, what, you know, the fact that these are here are phenomenal for us to kind of learn from. And I went through them and I was like, all right, what was the mindset of these guys? What were they writing about? How were they writing? Who were they referencing? What were they talking about? And it was really fascinating because, and I've not heard this anywhere else, so I don't know the validity of it, but in my mind, it was, if those two had never met, it likely would have never happened. Because from what I could tell, Eric he had the short hair, he was the shorter guy. Dylan was the taller guy, a bit lankier. And when you go through the diaries, the journals chronologically, Eric has a overwhelming contempt for humanity. He from the beginning absolutely despised humanity, saw himself as a god, and wanted to commit as much violence against humanity as he possibly could in order to seek revenge for existing, essentially.
Wow.
Whereas Dylan, on the other hand, at the beginning of the journals, he's just depressed. He feels awkward. There's a girl he likes, and I may be misremembering certain details, but like from what I'm recalling, because I read it last time I read it was in high school. There's a girl he had a crush on that like he couldn't talk to because he was too nervous, and you know, he felt out of place. But then you see, as the journal goes on, the more time he spends with Eric, the more he starts to write like Eric. You know, he goes from a kid who doesn't know where he fits in, he's depressed, and he's just looking, you know, he's looking for confidence he can't find in himself, to then somebody who is mirroring this level of contempt. He's essentially been infected by Eric's worldview to the point where then he obviously gets to the point where he follows him along as an accomplice in this horrible act that then, you know, spiraled into dozens and dozens more after the fact. And it's interesting because, you know, and I bring up the book Panzram, that, you know, I don't know if you've read it or if you're familiar with it at all. So the reason why I read it was because, you know, back in, you know, when I first discovered Peterson, he was recommending, he was like, if you want to understand, you know, maliciousness and evil, you have to read this book about Karl Panzram. And essentially this kid, you know, he ends up growing into a man. But from day one, as a child, he is like extremely abused in, it's like a, you know, Christian or Jesuit school with like a paddle, and like a paddle that had like holes in it, and they didn't involve salt water, and like it just horrific. And he was the victim of I don't know what we can say here, but a certain type of abuse from faculty members, and just like, you know, other, you know, leaders in that school, and it just for years and years, and he became so angry at that. You know, he just was continuously rebelling against it to the point where he would, you know, he would essentially get the punishments. You know, he would do something to receive the punishments, essentially as a middle finger to the staff. And they were like, he essentially, as a child, I can endure this because I hate you. And then as he grew, and even beyond that school, he became homeless, and he, you know, then had to like rob and steal for his livelihood. You know, he would experience that elsewhere in the world. You know, he just was an eternal victim as a child into a young man. And then as he grew and became stronger and became tougher, he then started to commit those acts against other people as just pure revenge against humanity. And it got to the point where he, you know, he was essentially at Genghis Khan level, but he didn't have an army. He was just a single man. But the most interesting part of the book, which I don't hear people talk about, is at a prison in Washington State, where he was for a number of years. He, as this person, hates all of humanity, does everything he can to cause as much harm and damage as he possibly can at all times. There is one guard, and I can't remember the guard's name, but there's a guard who gives him extra food, who talks with him, who I think gave him like a pen and paper to draw or to write or something along those lines. I think it was to write because half of the book is autobiography, half of it's biography. And this guard develops a friendship with Karl Panzram. And Panzram writes in the book in an autobiographical way, I absolutely despise all of humanity except for this guy. Like I would like I would murder every person I could other than him. And it gets to a point where it's like it's very close to him being transferred somewhere. And there's two things happened. One, I think in the writing, he like actually starts to have a little bit of optimism about his own life and people because of this single relationship with somebody that he had. And then at one point he escapes this prison. And I can't remember the exact reason, but it's either somewhere along the lines of, you know, he didn't want harm coming to other inmates as a result of what he was doing, or it was because of his friendship with this guard. Even though he's escaped many prisons many times, he voluntarily came back. And like, again, it's hazy because I haven't read it since high school, and I can't remember what he specifically says about why he did it. But eventually he was put to death. And I think that was you know what? I think that's what it was. I think he was on his way to be transferred to the prison where he would be executed at that point. And I think that was part of why he did it. But anyway, so the point I'm making there is this man had every reason to hate humanity, and he did. But one person in his life as a positive force was enough to make him A, at least forgive that individual, and B, start to forgive humanity even after all of the suffering he endured. And I think that's relevant to Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, because it's like if Dylan had anyone in his life other than Eric, it's possible that he never may have been involved. It's possible that he may have been able to essentially been saved from the inevitable fate that he, you know, allowed himself to be a part of. And I think it's interesting because like that's a great example. I read a book a year ago. It was the I have it sitting here. It's which one is it? There it is. The Violence Project, and it's about, you know, school shootings. And there was an instance with a woman who was a school counselor, and a young girl came in one day, and she said, "Hey, I'm worried about this kid. I think, you know, he seems a little off. I'm worried that something may be up with him." And so she invites him into her office. They have a brief conversation. Clearly, he's, you know, depressed and like things are going on, but nothing really comes of that conversation. And I think it was either the next week or later that week, he came into her office again, and he said he had a hoodie on, and he unzipped it, and he had a firearm in his hoodie, and he said, "I'm planning to do this today, and you are the only reason that you right now are the only thing that can stop me." And so she throughout the day was able to progressively like talk him down to the point where I think it ended with them, and it sounds like something out of a movie, but I think they ended up in like a mutually crying embrace. And, you know, and it never happened, thankfully. But it's like it's just those moments where, you know, and, you know, we hear the recommendations all the time. It's like, look out for people and like lend a hand. If you see somebody who seems to be off or having, you know, issues, the best thing you can do is just lend him an ear for a little bit. Let them know you care.
It sounds like this is the contrast that I'm going to try to draw here. You know, I'm like a generation ahead of you. And for me, dealing with like existential questions, it is different than about the reality of God or not, is different than dealing with nihilism versus optimism. And I think that it's hard for even millennials, because I had a conversation on this channel, hasn't released yet, with 3 Zoomers the other day. And when Peterson would say stuff like on podcasts, he would say stuff like, it's amazing how little encouragement is out there for young men. Like, he's like, and it doesn't even take that much. The contrast between him helping me synthesize like the existential questions I was dealing with, maybe with, and you could speak to this, do you think that Peterson was helping fight nihilism for a lot of young men, like 10 years younger than me, that were in these states, like in high school and headed to college? Because that was your demographic.
Yep.
8 years ago. Was that the place people, that age of people, were hearing a lot of him from? I'm curious.
I think so. I think, you know, I semi-jokingly will say that he was the father of my generation for those who felt like they didn't have one. Now, I'm the exception where, like, I love my father and we've always had a good relationship, and, you know, thankfully, you know, we're good. But it just so happens that he's not interested in all of the things I'm interested in. I'm not interested in all the things that he's interested in.
Yeah.
As people are. And, you know, we've grown towards each other in that sense, because, like, you know, he's interested, like, we both learned different things, and I was in the position where I was young enough where I hadn't learned the things I wanted to learn yet. And now that I have, we can have really interesting conversations where we're teaching each other things. It's
awesome.
great. It's fun. Yeah, I'm excited about it. But at that time, you know, it was like, there were a lot of these things that, you know, he's got a life, he's got a job, he's not investigating, you know, philosophy. He was, you know, really good football guy. He's, you know, he does great in sales. Like, you know, he has his niche. Whereas I'm like, you know, how do I break down an engine, and, you know, what is the meaning of life? Like those were the questions I wanted to answer. And so, you know, Peterson interested in me in that area, but I also had the viewpoint of, you know, having a healthy relationship with my father, but then also being interested in it. I was also kind of in that world, and I saw a lot of the other people that were in his audience. And, you know, I even heard him say things about it. I had conversations with other people, and it's like, yeah, for most of his audience that were guys my age, it was people looking for that fatherly role model that they didn't have. And I think part of the issue with that is, and this is, I'm going off total off reservation conjecture here, is I think because the world has gotten so complicated, as an innate, repercussion of, the the Industrial Revolution, and I won't go through that quote, but like for example, I own a 1989 Ford truck, and the reason I got the year I got was because almost everything on it is mechanical. There's not a lot of, computers or anything in it, though I have, interest in learning how computer-based cars work. At the end of the day, when that truck breaks down, I can bring a wrench outside and work on it, unless I destroy like the entire engine and it needs to be rebuilt. But like, I can't, I can't I can't torque wrench a microchip. I can't weld a computer processor. These are things that need to be worked on in a factory with microscopes. And it's like, I am thoroughly impressed by their existence. I'm amazed by the level of, you know, absolute precision that is required for things like that. But for something in my own life, I'd love to be able to fix something when it breaks. But for modern cars, it's not really a thing. You have to rely on other people, which isn't innately a bad thing. But I think every human has a desire to be useful. And whether through innate interest or social conditioning, men tend to have an interest in things and they have an interest in providing. And in a world where it's getting harder and harder for men to be useful like that, and in a societal structure where having masculine traits is becoming more and more of an issue, it's hard for especially young men to find a place in the world, especially young men who are not, let's say, athletic stars or particularly, uh, you know, genius level in, some form of like engineering or design. They have their roles. But for the majority of us, kind of like in the middle, it's like, where do we go? What do we do? The natural inclinations, whether we're born with it or whether they're conditioned, they're there, but we have them. And it's like, all right, well, what do we do with them? Because it seems like, all of the ways that traditionally I could have been useful, even going back to like, repairing an ox cart, it's like, no, I can't, I don't have the ability to tune the microprocessors in my Tesla, because it needs to be done via an app that is proprietary that I barely
Connected to a
understand.
satellite.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, I love that that exists. I think it's awesome. But at the individual level, it's hard because it's you're running out of ways to be useful
Mm.
in that regard. And so I think with that question arising with a young generation that's looking for answers, he was the antidote for that. And I mean, unfortunately, he's kind of like the other side of the coin where like Andrew Tate was also the antidote for people, which I don't think was a good antidote, but I can understand the appeal for a young man who wants to feel powerful and important, why what he was saying was appealing. But yeah, I mean, that's what I think it is generally.
So,
What about
yeah,
you?
he did. So I mean, like I said, I think the way I outlined and I come to it was reconciling like an existential question. And I had a personal experience that's also like in between there that was kind of a metaphysical, mystical type thing that I had that I experienced, that also was through his work, and others like Jonathan Peugeot helped me reconcile like some of the symbolic stuff, and his work with archetypes, which was a big part of that conversation with Dawkins as well. But so that's where I'm coming from. But I think that as a whole, millennials were still a lot more optimistic, because we made Facebook, we made social media, we saw things we as a generation, we did something for better, for worse, just like the Industrial Revolution, for better, for worse. We did some, and I think that the Zoomers like that, and so we even have an identity. We inherited that institutional identity as being productive to society, and that I do think is still been a question for Gen Z as a generation. I mean, you as a person, you are being productive. I mean, I'll point back to that plaque on the wall. Great job. Hard work, dude. That's cool. I mean,
I will say it is all reliant on my buddy's research. And the channel would not exist without the 60 to 80 hours a week he puts in to that research. Yeah, I mean, it is very much a partnership. So it's not, I can't claim full responsibility for that in any stretch of the imagination.
I can't claim responsibility for social media, but I just did.
Fair.
but I'm just saying, I think that culturally, that's something that I had to go back to school. I became a registered nurse and had to start a new career. And a kid I met there, close to your age, he actually came out of like this Jehovah's Witness. I don't know if you know much about that organization, because of Dawkins. And then he kind of, through conversation and relationship, came into a theistic faith because of Peterson and other influences. And so it's like, I saw, but even within him and listening to his journey and that relationship, I'm just recognizing that I do think that it is way more common, even though the characters you mentioned with school shootings, they were, of my generation and stuff, but that was like an exception, like a hardcore exception, but also I think a projection of the future that, that we might be dealing with. And again, like that was the thing that I think I heard Peterson say a lot and even get emotional about, is like how little encouragement there is. And I again, like you were talking about that fatherly role. However, the question that you pushed that forward to is, well, what can we do to be productive? Like, what's the, if a lot of these options are disappearing because of the technology that in some ways we're thankful for, but also it's like a double-edged sword. What can we do? And I mean, I think that the other piece of it is conversation and the people that, like yourself, that did receive the positive side of this, help infuse that back into the culture through, like, I mean, it sounds like you're involved in media. We didn't really talk about the specifics of your other channel, like what your projects are, and so that might be interesting. What are those projects, the research and the stuff that you work on your other channels?
Sure. So I can answer that, and then there were a couple points that you said there that I'd love to respond to as well. But yeah, in terms of the other channels, so the Lore Lodge it's interesting. It started primarily as like a I'll call it supernatural channel, because my buddy we grew up watching the show Supernatural, and I loved it for a variety of reasons. There's a reason that I dress very Americana and I drive a Chevy muscle car that's black. There's a lot of reasons for that. But in particular, one of his minors, so he majored in medieval history. One of his minors was theology, and he was always interested in the idea of the supernatural beings existing. I was always, especially after my atheistic stint, I was a lot more skeptical, even though there were events in my life which, I could never be fully atheist because I've had, religious and spiritual experiences that I can't be shaken from, like, because they happened. So it's like, I will never be 100% atheist, and it's not possible. And I'm even getting away from that now, because it's like the primary instance was when I was like 4 or 5 years old. My mom's mother's dad passed, and my mom was on the phone with her mom in like a completely different part of the house. Early in the morning, they were talking about it, whatnot. And at like 8 in the morning, they got up at like 5 and they were having that conversation. And then I get up at like 8 in the morning and I waltz in, like, in my diaper. And my mom's like, "Hey, honey, how you doing? Good morning," or whatever. And I said, "Pop Jim died last night, didn't he?" And she was like, "What?" And she's like, "Why did you say that?" And I look at her and I say, "Because God told me in my sleep last night." And she was like, "What?" And apparently I was like, yeah, no, he just like, he said he was happy and all things are good. And, he's in heaven now. And it's, it's all good. And then I just waltzed away, and she's sitting there on the phone with her mother, and she's like, oh, what?
Oh.
And there was one other instance where it was, this was in high school, right around the point where things were starting to change and I was pulling away from the whole atheism thing. And I'm walking into I'm in a Target parking lot with my aunt and uncle. And I think we were stopping in to get candy before going to see a movie. Because I was with a couple of my other cousins as well. And for whatever reason, I'm just I'm starting to question a lot of stuff. And I'm like, man, if I should be more concerned or interested with theology, you got to give me a sign here. I need something. And I don't know where it is, but we were walking through Target and all the shelves were really stocked or whatever, except there was one shelf at the end of the aisle, one of those narrow shelves at the very end of an aisle. And it was totally empty except for this one bucket on the second shelf below the top. And for whatever reason, I was weird that that's the only thing on a shelf and then everything else is empty. So for whatever reason, I don't know why I thought to do it, but I went behind the bucket and felt around. And it was this card that just said, "What if" on the front of it. And it was this whole what if this, what if that, what if whatever. And the very last sentence was what if Jesus died on the cross for your sins? And I was like, all right, come on. That's way too on the nose. All right, well done. Well done. I asked, you responded. That was great. Very impressed. So, I could never definitively say no to any of that. But anyway, so where was I going with this? Where did I?
Yeah, I guess what are ways that Gen Z can be productive into the world, but also your other channels, the work on your other channels.
Right. So that's right. Sorry. I was doing a little bit too much of a weave there. So that's what allowed me to kind of be able to get, into, that mindset of being a skeptic, but still being open to the conversations. And that's part of what we do on the Weird Bible, is that they come at it from a very theological, historical perspective. And then I bring the secular side, essentially, the one who's there's potential validity here, but for somebody who may struggle with the spiritual or the theological element of this, are there still relevant things, applicable, symbolism that could then be transferred into real life, moral lessons that could be taken from this that are actually still, relevant to today. So that's what I provide on the Weird Bible side. On the Lore Lodge side, so it was a lot more open to supernatural things in the beginning. And now as we've gone along, and as my buddy, also named Aidan, has done more and more research, we have found that, so for example, the last video we did was on the disappearance and then, unfortunate demise of Jordan Grider up in Minnesota. And the thing we talk about at the end of the video as a possible reason for that is a Wendigo. And 3 years ago, we would have been yeah, the big supernatural creature with mythical powers. It's no. We've done the research. The term Wendigo actually comes from this specific native tribal group, and it doesn't necessarily mean what is in the media now. It's actually just somebody who has willingly consumed human flesh, and then they become, there's a thing called Wendigo psychosis where you become obsessed with eating human flesh. And that's a documented psychological phenomenon that they knew about back then, and they just called it the Wendigo. In their interpretation, you were possessed by the spirit of the Wendigo, or you just, became obsessed with this. And it's all right, well, that's a possible thing here. But we've gone, and he has done the research and has found the original, seminal instances of these mythical stories to find where are they based in reality. And other things, Bigfoot, is we have found the first instance of that being discussed is actually referred to in the stories of a journalist in the 1850s called, I think it was Burns, J.W. Burns, I think his name was. And he was up in the Pacific Northwest with the Coast Salish tribes. And they had a story about a different tribe that lived in the mountains they called the Saskets. Sasquatch. And the Saskets was a tribe of people who were taller, hairier, and or just wore a lot of like animal pelts because it was colder up in the mountains, and they disguised themselves as more animalistic. And they had their own language, but they could speak the Salish language. And they would stay up in the mountains most of the year, but then they would come down in the summers and steal women from the other tribes in the area. And so this story of the Saskets was well known by the Salish, and then it just kind of became, as stories do, mythologized. It's like, all right, well, they're not people that are bigger and hairier. They're ape creatures, and they're primal primitive primates, that exist or whatever. So that's kind of the game of telephone that seems to have occurred there. So that's what we do there. Along with just generally covering missing persons cases and debunking conspiracies. So in terms of like how that has kind of influenced my view in terms of nihilism and optimism and things like that, one of the things that has been required of doing that, more so of my buddy than I, but it involves both of us, is because we're looking at a lot of these stories. And another thing we debunked was the whole flat earth thing. And then the MH370 video that came out last year, we did the debunking of that. And it has really resonated with us both in our own lives and through the work that we do, how misleaded or how much people have been misled. Even from things like, with JFK, the whole Martin Luther King issue, in terms of like his assassination. We covered the Tuskegee experiment. There are other, Unit 731, Wendigo did a great video on that. Like all of these different things that have occurred that most people don't know about. We covered Charles Manson and the MK Ultra issue, and just like all of the details there. And obviously, there's the whole Ruby Ridge and Waco thing, but like all of these instances in even recent history where we have been blatantly lied to about a variety of different details, from the littlest things to, full-scale cover-ups of issues. Like MH370, for instance. The conclusion that we came to was because the whole thing that came out was this video of it from a supposed drone showing it go through a wormhole. And I did a whole VFX breakdown of like, hey, no, these assets are clearly from the 90s, based on what Corridor Crew was able to show. This is how you would change it to that. Also, the two thermal imaging, readouts show opposite results. So they're definitely not the same thing. But aside from that point, my buddy did all the research and he's like, well, considering all of the data, it doesn't seem like the pilot was politically motivated based on anything that exists on his social media. It wasn't a wormhole. And the most likely thing was the plane was carrying a shipment of like several hundred kilograms of lithium-ion batteries that were unsecured in the cargo hold. And if anybody knows anything about lithium-ion batteries, it's that if one ignites, which it can spontaneously, it'll start a chain reaction and ignite all of them. And if a massive amount of them are in the cargo hold, which is not easily accessible during flight, then you've essentially doomed the plane. And the reason that we settled on that was because my buddy found in his research that a few years after that, suddenly all of the aviation regulatory agencies across the world slowly start banning lithium-ion shipments in quantities in excess of a certain amount, and they're no longer allowed in cargo holds. And you can only have them on your person in the fuselage in like your carry-on items, because then at least it can be addressed. It'll be small enough it can be addressed. So, but that's the thing, is like they could have said that was the reason, but it would have looked bad for the airlines. It would have looked bad for the regulatory agencies that, they didn't do it right. Even something like the BP oil spill, or any number of the disasters like East Palestine, or, all of these different things. It's like you see all of these instances of cover-ups, and in some of them you see blatant, evidence that it was covered up. Another one, a great movie that came out not long ago, was Dark Waters, starring Mark Ruffalo, about C8 and the Teflon issue, and how poisonous that was for everybody. And the fact that, DuPont knew. They did the studies when they first developed it, knew that it caused cancer, knew that it caused problems, and they hid it blatantly because it was cheaper. because they were making too much money, and they figured, well, if anything pops up, any lawsuits, it'll be cheaper to settle that out of court and continue to make it than not. And so there's so many of these pieces of evidence throughout history that now, because of social media, because of channels like us, and because plenty of other great channels that are out there, that information is known. Everybody has access to be able to find it. And I think, especially with my generation who consumes that media now from the get-go as entertainment and education, everywhere you turn, it's people are lying to you. I mean, even going back to journalism, there was the repeal in 1986 of, I can't remember the name of the repeal, but essentially it was, there was a doctrine up until that point that any news media that was put out into the public had to have a level of neutrality. You had to cover an issue from both sides, and then that was repealed. And then, of course, then you had the 24-hour news cycle. So you could have biased news outlets like Fox and MSNBC that were just essentially, feeding, slop to whoever was watching it of exactly what they wanted to hear. And it's like, again, all of these things pile up. And I'm someone who believes that both Occam's razor and Hamlin's razor. And Hamlin's razor is essentially anything that could be attributed to, do not attribute anything to malice that could be attributed to ignorance or stupidity.
Incompetent.
And exactly. And I truly don't think there are a lot of large conspiracies. Some exist, but I think it's generally just a lot of mostly incompetent people running an incompetent system that occasionally goes well for some of the people that are running it. But it's just, there are, and I think this is an issue in terms of what we saw in the Dawkins and Peterson debate, is that there are too many people that are way too hyper-focused on one specific niche of life. Dawkins is a prime example. He is not interested in anything that isn't evolutionary biology, and that has prevented him from being able to see what Peterson's asking him to just look at, which is the relevance of memes as archetypes, as, pieces in the foundational, fabric of human, society and civilization. It's like, even if you just wanted to look at the biblical stories as purely secular, as something that humanity developed through millennia of wisdom as how society best functions, you have to acknowledge the validity of that at the time up until the Industrial Revolution, when so many things changed. When you look at like a lot of the things that are considered bad in the Bible, most of it boils down to the fact that the infant mortality rate was so high. Being not straight is bad, because if anybody's not reproducing, that's inadvertently potentially leading to the demise of your society. And same thing with like eating shellfish, or there was another one that I referred to as well, but it's like shellfish were a higher risk food,
or menstrual purity, things like that.
Exactly. It's like almost all of that is relevant to essentially just reproduction in a society where you had to have 12 kids because only 3 of them were going to make it. But
that's a really interesting intersection to take it back to that conversation with Peterson, is being hyper focused on quote unquote the facts on Dawkins or logic or something like that, and then quote unquote being hyper focused on mythology, and trying to come to that point of synthesis, which is kind of, I think it sounds like why it was so captivating and even emotionally charged for you, because that's kind of sounds like that's part of your work. And what's interesting and we're seeing it happen in these mimetic to these real things that happen and then getting abstract into some kind of misinformation type situation, whether on purpose or not, then mimetically being like propagated through the culture so fast through Twitter and Reddit and everything else, that it's like we're seeing those things happen incredibly fast. And then to get to that point where they get to this Baldwin effect, that's like these things that it's not just genetics, but these things can happen abstracted from the physical in the ideal landscape. And I think that was why it connected to you so deeply, because you're like, I'm doing this. I could be wrong, but it's like, and that was the part that was so interesting to me was, and I'm sure that I've heard this, but whenever they describe the predator and prey, and then that being abstracted into the mimetic, is that what we're trying to do, and what I think I'm trying to do, is then bring that down into the conversation landscape, because it shoots up there, and then we're in the ideas, and that's where Dawkins was stuck with Christianity and culture. It just gets stuck in the idea landscape, and we're trying to come back down here and deal with it. And I've had some really interesting conversations. I'd be interested for you to listen to my conversations with Justin Wells, because he works in Hollywood and deals with documentary filmmaking, and he's a cameraman out there, and he's in the industry, and he's really interested in story and the archetypes. And what I could hear from you saying was, you're seeing almost, even in the past 100 years, this archetypal idea of Bigfoot, being able to understand how the story gets abstracted and becomes such a clear archetype, like something so real. This idea of Bigfoot, we can just like understand, and it affects things and comes back down, and people go and look for it and build community around it and these types of things. And that is wild to be able to think that Dawkins hasn't been able to understand that. And then when Peterson's talking about Cain and Abel or Abraham, like, he's saying there's something real, or even the dicey things that, they wanted to just get him. Now, are you like Anya Hersey Ali? Are you going to just claim the virgin birth? Because then we can just like pile on and this conversation's over. And he knew it would be over. I think you mentioned that too. Like, he knew it would be over if he just left it at that. But I like the way that you nuanced also projecting onto him something I would probably do as well, which is that I think he does have some metaphysical beliefs at this point. And I also think that, like related to his wife and family in that way, but also he has a respect for the institutions as well that he has kind of partnered with in this endeavor that he's on, to be like, I'm not going to just throw him under the bus right now either, just to try to get Dawkins' point. So you said he had to be careful so that they could get past that old argument. And it took, like you said, almost an hour and a half to get there. But there's a lot going on there. And I do think that you're, to the point of the work that you're doing with your partner and on those channels, you're seeing those things happen over the course of 50 to 100 years. And I think that's because, I grew up hearing about Bigfoot, and, there were movies. Harry and the Hendersons, I think, was one of the big Bigfoot movies in like the late 80s or something. And characterized in even like a movie or shows like the Goofy movie, there's a Bigfoot scene and stuff. It's like, but to hear that, where that legend comes from, and that it is actually based in a type of truth, and like, we need to be able to look at these mythologies seriously, because they are dealing with real things. And I don't know, I'm excited to be in that conversation, and that our culture is getting there. Of course, there's a lot of this, there's so much else going on too. That is difficult, related to the types of nihilism, related to politics, related to the culture, and how fast things are moving. But at the same time, there's these moments that break through. And I resonated. I felt like I resonated with you, because you just had an energy about that, your response, and even I would say like an emotional response that I resonated with too, because like even that clip, I don't know if you meant to, or it's just the time of day, but it sounded like your voice kind of broke when you said it was beautiful. And I think that I could be wrong, but that was coming from like a really genuine place. I mean, because you're up at 4 a.m. recording this thing, because it's like, so like you're like right there.
Yeah, there was definitely some emotion in that. There was also the fact that I've been talking for an hour and a half, and
Yeah,
like,
that's
it
what I
was
like,
starting to get to the point. But no, I mean, like, there was a foundation of emotion there, purely because of the fact that of the time that I decided to do it, is that I was sitting at this desk in my apartment, and I was like, I got to go back over to the studio and record this, because it's like, this is the time. This is what we have to do. And I got to say real quick, just for what you were saying there, kind of made me make a connection in my neurons of what we're talking about here, and what you're highlighting, I think, is really important. And it also made me realize that that conversation was an extrapolation, and that was a idea mimetic version of the divide that's going on in society as a whole. Because I think the biggest issue right now in what Peterson refers to as the postmodernist side, or the secular side, the atheist side, and the religious side, is there are valid criticisms of the Bible today because it defends things that no longer pertain to society as a whole. And I think the issue is that because of that, and especially people who have emotional charged reasons to be against what the Bible defends in that scenario, they're, in a sense, they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because they're like, all right, well, this is evidence that this text is, an anachronistic text. It is antiquated. It no longer serves a purpose in society. Whereas you have the other side, the other extreme side, which says, no, all of it is still relevant. Because or you can't question it because it came from God. And I think that the conversation that needs to be had is, all right, we have to recognize that some of the, clearly in the positions in the Bible where it defends slavery in any sense is outdated. Even the most devout Christians will say yes to that. And it's like, okay, great, that's the start. What else is outdated? Can we confirm or deny that? Are we willing to suggest that something that was put together 2,000 years ago may need an update? And considering the fact that even one of the most strict churches, that being the Catholic Church, is willing to make changes throughout time, it's evidence in point, in the case in point that, religion is capable and willing to do that. So I think the conversation that needs to be had between the secular and the religious, the atheist and the theist, is, right, this book existed for thousands of years because it got a lot of things right for a long time. The world's changed. There's still a lot of good stories, good morals, good pieces that exist in here that we're not doing that we'd benefit from doing. But why don't we take an academic approach and sift through everything and make sure that what we're doing is right? Because in my mind, it's like, yeah, gay marriage was bad because it didn't allow people to exist. It could have, the lack of reproduction would have been a degradation against society in a time at which infant mortality was high. That no longer exists. We live in a society now where infant mortality rate has dropped substantially to a point where, adoption is second nature for some people. And, there are a variety of other ways that people can, have children. It's like, all right, well, that's clearly no longer an issue. So what do we do about that? How do we contend with that in an era where the risk to society of that, issue is no longer present? Same with seafood. And obviously that one's been ignored a lot more and, for a lot longer. But I think there's these issues within the Bible that we just need to have these conversations with, and then investigate them, interrogate them, and come to a conclusion together. Because I think as long as you're not too hyper-focused in your own niche and you're willing to talk to the other side, whether it be the other side of belief or the other side of profession, the other side of, academia, or, however you would want to put it, they're valuable. Even the most different people can learn something from each other. There is something of value in everybody's story. And as long as you're willing to listen to it and digest it and apply it to your own life and find that common ground, then I think that's the only pathway to a better society. And I think as long as we keep preaching the ability to do that, I think we'll get there.
That's partially partially, it's a huge part of why what Peterson was doing allowed people to, for one, to jump back into a type of religious faith, because it legitimized, it gave people a way to contend with some of what you're talking about evolutionarily. It was big. That was a huge deal, like a massive deal, actually, for people that were contending in that space. For them intellectually, that was a very difficult bridge to make. He did that. And I agree that the journey, I think sometimes saying it's a difficult word, well, this is for people in certain areas. The Bible got this wrong, and maybe a way to bridge that gap is well, maybe there's a deeper understanding or something, we're not understanding this. There's ways sometimes that people come in and they hear these words and it's just like alarm bells. Bang, I just can't even. But being willing, and again, I'll go back to that that idea that even Brett Weinstein gave in some of those early conversations was the idea of steel manning instead of straw manning. Is like, okay, well, it's like even giving something the benefit of the doubt in a situation like what would happen previously with a Dawkins and a Hitchens, and Harris was just like, no, well, look, this isn't divinely inspired. This thing's obviously wrong historically, or X, Y, and Z. So the whole thing's bunk. And the people on the other side were like, no, nothing can be wrong. And if anything's wrong, my whole faith fall apart. So I've got to defend it to the death. And that was like a gridlock. And again, I mean, there's reasons for, you know, I guess there's a third component, at least on the religious side, that I think that continues to need to be dealt with. And people in this space, specifically a guy named John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist, actually out of the University of Toronto, where Peterson came from, talks about something called the advent of the sacred. And it isn't simply just sitting down and parsing out like the facts of what can be useful now. Like, well, if we can just get the thing, like the conversation about gay and relationships straight, getting the conversation about that figured out with facts, then we can move on. And that's kind of, there's this whole other piece to humanity that is about the religious impulse in and of itself. And I think because the question isn't just, can we figure this out intellectually and sift through, even though I think that is continually happening. There's this whole other side of what it means to be human and how we operate and we participate in the world through things like a type of religious practice that is almost something separate in a way of that we find meaning, and that there's actually like how we operate within the world isn't just arbitrary. It isn't just neutral, but if when Peterson talks about orienting yourself to the highest goal or good, and like that ways that we do that, whether that's through a liturgy of picking up YouTube in the morning and trying to find the best, thing to stimulate my mind, or go and be a part of like a religious practice that helps orient me, not just intellectually, but even physically, in how I posture myself. That there's a type of wisdom, there's a type of knowing there that that in that previous conversation, again, was only about the facts. And I think there's something to even like this idea of your illustration with the 1989 Ford pickup and the wrench, and like this, the doing and the way that you can have knowledge that isn't just the facts about the motor, but like, how to hold the wrench or the torque wrench, and where to position yourself to do these things, that those are not arbitrary as well. And I think you can put that into like religious practices, whether that's around a campfire, whether that's facing an altar or something like that, that I think that in the, like the thing Vervaeke would talk about is that we're in a type of wisdom famine, because again, the kind of epistemological world that we live in about knowledge doesn't then take us to a point where do we get wisdom, how to operate in this world? And a lot of it's taken for granted in the West. And a lot of that happens to be built on a type of, like, even you even gestured at it, talking about morality within this religious structure that we are kind of, Peterson would say, is, the underpinnings of the narrative underpinnings substrate of Western civilization. So that's a part of, also, I talk to a lot of people that are involved in like the Orthodox Christian church, and it's such an embodied experience with the, like, and if you went to some Catholic masses, depending on how traditional they were, you may have seen some of this, but like, just like this intense mode of worship that's stimulating other parts of consciousness and other parts of knowing that does things. I just think that does things. It's doing things more than just arguing facts back and forth. So I don't know. And for a younger generation that, again, like we've come so far from those religious underpinnings. And again, I don't think that's just like the complete answer in a certain way, but that there's a piece of that there as well. And even about like trust, like because the premise of that one podcast that you're doing with your friend, what's it called?
So the investigative one is Lore Lodge, and then the Bible one is called the Weird Bible.
Yeah, like that's I feel like there's this deep longing for trust, that's been broken down on so many levels, just like that story about the I don't know if he was a serial killer, but he was that you mentioned early, Ram.
Oh, Pan's Ram. Yeah, he was.
It's like he was abused within religious structures, and like we have a huge problem there.
Yeah.
And then our political structures that even you're talking about, like within the kind of conspiratorial realms, like we've been abused with truth in those structures, that trying to find places to grow, cultivate, and experience deep trust is like, where do I go?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, those kind of a part of where I'm meeting you at, and why I just think that, when you put out that video, man, and I'm like seeing like this, there was an intensity. I mean, you went on, just like full throttle for 2 hours because of this, these intense things that are in our culture. And that's one of the crucibles that's been happening is this conversation between Peterson and Dawkins and mythos and new atheism and whatnot. And it is encouraging to be able to start to see like a model of dialogue, discourse come back out into the public spaces. And even I hope like today has been something that has been fruitful in that way, or like that we've been able to kind of come together on in that certain way. I don't know, but that's kind of some of the space on, like when I hear him talking about, like, because obviously I mentioned I am a Christian, and so I do have like beliefs based on these things, but the problem is that I've just watched, just like you say, if you're gonna hold those things in a certain way and in a certain posture, it goes nowhere. It's like, and we can't move forward in figuring out a way to build trust with people unless we can figure out how to have those conversations.
Yeah, 100%. I think in direct reference to everything you just said, I think the biggest thing is people need to be willing, because we are in a position where almost every structure of authority has betrayed us as a society in some way in the last few lifetimes. We're in a position where now we feel we're scorned, and there is no trust, and we keep being given reasons not to trust those things. I think if we ever want to get to a point of trust, I think it starts with ourselves. I think we have to be willing to interrogate ourselves about our beliefs. Yep. From a variety of different angles, to say, and most people, it's uncomfortable because yep. You know what, the very fair point is, a lot of people don't usually have the time, because it's, life is busy, life is complicated, life is stressful, and life is hard. And why would you want to bring more hardship on yourself that you barely have time for when you're focused on feeding your family, or, completing your job, and, just finding meaning in your life? And I think, kind of like exercise, it's one of those deals where it's just sacrifice you're making to better yourself and the world around you. And if you can take a little bit of time, and I think that's a prime example of the benefit of prayer. If you look at prayer from an entirely secular perspective, it's a point in time in which you are separating yourself from the rest of your life to reflect both on yourself, your actions, your community, and how you are existing in your community, and how you might better exist in your community. And I think if we're able to do that with ourselves, starting with like, okay, who am I? What do I believe? Why do I believe it? And then taking those beliefs, taking the justifications for those beliefs, and analyzing them and confirming whether or not they're true. Obviously, from a religious perspective, it's going to be a little harder. But if you look at it kind of like I just extrapolated prayer, it's like, okay, well, is there a defense of this? If not, that's going to require a little bit more conversation. But if there is, great. Now I know why I'm doing this thing. Now I know I'm justified in doing this thing, not just because of my belief in it, but because I can think of a valid reason for it. And obviously you got to be willing to be malleable and continue to have those conversations, but just providing yourself an initial structure. And I think once we're all capable of doing that to some extent with ourselves, then we do it with those around us, then within our community, and then ideally we get to the point where we and those running the authoritative structures of religion, politics, all of these different things are willing to be interrogated in that same manner and say, yeah, that's valid. That's not. This is where we've lied to you in the past. This is how we're going to be more honest with you in the future. And, it's a big stretch. It's going to take a lot of effort. But I think it's a collective action problem, just like voting, for any normal election is. We got to be willing to figure out from the individual perspective first. And then once we can do that, Peterson's whole idea of clean your room. If you can put yourself in order, and you can interrogate yourself on your beliefs and your ideas, and you get to a point where you can defend your beliefs and ideas truly without, an appeal to authority or an appeal to something, then you can move on, you can move forward, you can move to the next stage of conversation with other people. And granted, I mean, I'm jumping the gun a little bit here because I've not fully interrogated myself, and I'm not saying you have to be 100% certain of everything that you believe.
And who can
exactly,
but to be on that journey. And that's and that's partially, I mean, that's probably why I initially, labeled this thing YT, because I was just trying to get the handle to not have numbers at the end of it on my channel. I was like, and it's kind of corny, but I call it yours truly. And there's other reasons for that, but like, that is what I'm trying to do. That is where I'm meeting, and what I think it sounds like where we're meeting. And I think that that's really encouraging. Before we're kind of coming up on our time a little bit here, but before we do, I kind of wanted to ask you, because you mentioned earlier in the conversation that you felt attention to be like getting on YouTube to talk openly about some of these things in a certain way, like connected to your professionally. Is it just because now you are working in your own, you didn't maybe go that mainstream route, that you feel like you can talk about some of these things? Or do you feel like there's other currents in the culture that have changed enough to where you feel like you can talk about some of these things?
Honestly, it's more that I just kept seeing instances where people's fears were holding them back.
Yeah.
And that's, if I'm being completely honest, it's entirely where I've been for ever since I've made the channel. It was like, it got way more successful on the first video than I ever anticipated. And I immediately got scared. I was like, I can't do this. Like, I can't be true to myself, because people aren't going to like that. And it's going to not allow me to do the other things I want to do. And, I kept having people in my personal life, and along with that, seeing people in, other professional circles say, people only regret the things they didn't do. You can't let fear hold you back, this, that, or whatever. But it really hit me when, like, some of the other YouTubers that, we've been communicating with have essentially said, was like, why are you not doing this too? Like, I understand that you're doing the production side for what you guys are doing, and it takes two to tango for the style of videos you're doing. But like, why are you not doing something as well? And I'd have to give a half-assed answer, but I knew the inside answer was because I'm scared.
Yeah.
And it just got to a point where it was like, we're doing pretty well, but this won't last forever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my buddy and I both knew as soon as we started, is like, we're going to do as much as we can with the YouTube, but like, this is a well that will run dry. So let's see where it takes us. And the hope is, like, I would love to be able to make movies and TV shows at some point, or at least be able to write stories, if I can't do that. My buddy really would love to do game design at some point. But like, worst case scenario, he's fine with going back and teaching and things. But we're hoping we can keep the snowball growing, obviously. But at this point, I guess for me, I'm now in a position where it's like, I've had experience, I can translate it to my own thing. And, even though I don't have a ton of time to even do it, at the very least, there's no guarantee I'm ever going to do well. There's no guarantee the channel's going to grow. It could cap out at 20,000 subscribers for the rest of its existence. And I've just got a little community of people that, like to have really interesting conversations. And, in my mind, it's like, you know what? Cool. And if somebody doesn't hire me because I had an interesting conversation with somebody in a way in which I truly was just trying to express my own thoughts or hear someone else's and digest them, and I know what my motivation is. My motivation is I'm curious, I'm interested, and I just want everybody to live better. And if that's somehow problematic for somebody, then maybe that's not somebody I would want to work with to begin with. So
And
I think, what's that?
I love that.
Thank you. But yeah, so at the end of the day, I'm just, I guess I'm just not as much of a scaredy cat.
I felt the same way. I felt like it kind of came to this point where it's like, I have to talk about this stuff. I have to find people to talk about this stuff with. And to your point, I thought that was a really beautiful way to summarize, your coming out after 6 years or whatever on YouTube is that the guy I mentioned earlier is a guy named Paul Vanderklay. He's got like 30,000 subs, and he kind of rode the coattails in a similar way to the Peterson phenomenon. We just started having conversations with people, like random Joes with a web camera, and he had like 400 or 500. He calls them randos conversations. And out of that, there's been, a dozen or so people make channels with, a couple thousand followers, a couple hundred, couple thousand followers. And then we all kind of like interface through the comments and on Twitter. And he does live streams on Fridays, and people pop up that are in that space. And some people sometimes come out, they do take another step from maybe they'll comment for the first time. And then maybe they'll come up on his live stream or somebody else's live stream and take that step of courage that you were talking about, and it's a little different, but it's still, I think is still the seeds of in some ways that Channel 4 interview. And so I don't know. I think that's awesome, man. I don't know, coming in here, was there anything that we didn't cover today that was maybe on your mind, or you had questions about coming in here that we haven't covered?
No, I think we covered a lot. I was curious to see your opinions on some of the things that I, was having stir around in my mind, and I appreciate you just kind of hopping in and, carrying the conversation forward in that way. But the only thing I know is that I want to have more conversations in the future, because there's definitely, there's more I'd love to explore in terms of, I was writing down some of what you said in terms of Paul and in terms of John Vervaeke and such. I'd love to be able to go digest some of their content and then have conversations with you about that, because I'm really interested in some of the things that you've been saying and some of your positions on things. I will say the one thing that did come up is you specifically saying in relation to music, how sometimes you feel like you're just kind of like copying things, and it's you struggle with that bridge to creativity. But this is another topic for another conversation. But I did a deep dive into John Mayer back during COVID for a variety of different reasons. I'm a guitar player myself, and when
Okay.
I say, and one of the things that I remember him specifically saying about that, which I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, is when you're learning someone else's piece of music, the best thing you can do, and this is totally relevant to the conversation we're having here, is don't just learn the notes, learn the structure the notes were written with. So, for example, like if you're learning a guitar solo from like Eddie Van Halen or Stevie Ray Vaughan or even Mayer himself, investigate what are those notes. All right, what key is that in? What mode is that in? Is that Mixolydian? All right, why did that artist use that? What's the rest of that mode? What's the rest of that? What is it? Not just the key, the
Tempo, like
the tempo.
signature.
There's a time signature. There's a scale. What is the rest of that scale? How can you use other pieces of that scale to make that solo your own? Why did they choose those notes? What happens if you choose different notes and you play it slightly differently? How does the emotional tone of that solo change? And then you can apply that from the solo to chords to the rest of the song.
Yeah.
And I think that's the beautiful element of creativity, is like most of us all start out copying someone, because that's what creativity is. There are no new musical notes. There are no new stories. They're just new combinations of things that have existed for thousands of years. How do you take the colors on that palette and make your own picture? And you have to start by, doing a still life of fruit, as everybody has. You have to start by, playing hot cross buns on a recorder, and
Yeah.
then you slowly build from there. And so, yeah, I think that's the fun part about creativity, is that you have to, just like what we're talking about with belief, is you have to start with your structure, you have to investigate it, and then as you investigate it, you learn where everything came from, you learn where you got to where you are, and then once you know all the pieces, then you can start reorganizing them in ways that work for you.
Definitely. And I think my biggest struggle, I mean, when you're playing songs every Sunday and you're it's kind of a different kind of gig, but and there's all sorts of pieces there about kind of like really understanding genre versus just like the notes. Like I think that's kind of what he's pointing at in a certain way, and then being able to go out and experiment with that for yourself. I think that's true. And it's also the kind of like the idea of becoming like a producer instead of just a musician, like, and of course, and it's a big part of that. Yeah, man, I've been doing this series. There's a guy named Matt Hylam who is really, he's a musician that is, he's really, I say this word, oh, my wife always like, you say downstream all the time now. You say milieu all the time now. Downstream from this phenomenon. And he's, people like Ian McGilchrist and Peterson, and like he's implemented those ideas, he's absorbed those ideas, and now they're in his music. And so it's like these ideas of how to do that creatively. But even in this podcast, it's been a very free and creative journey, because I just decided, like, I'm not going to try to necessarily initially play these games of like, I'm just going to look at what people are doing and do them. I'm just going to like go to find things. Like I have to have these pieces. Like I have to have a thumbnail. I want to have a little intro thing. I want a brand, but I'm not going to go look at everybody whose brand is successful. I'm just going to try to find like what speaks to me. And so that was a really freeing thing, because when I was just trying to like copy everything that was successful for a very long time, I've had to break out of that. But yeah, man, we could have another conversation. Yeah. And that's the thing. Like if it makes sense, reach out to me. And if it makes sense for me, I'll reach out to you. Like if you want a conversation partner to explore some of these ideas with, I'm wildly open to that. There'll probably be some, if you look up Paul Vanderklay and, related to your podcast on the lore, there's a guy named Grim Grizz who's kind of, he comes out of the truther world, but he's kind of downstream from the Peterson thing. He's in this Paul Vanderklay corner of the internet. And it is like a synthesis of like relationality and trust, but coming from the kind of truther world that he came out of, so to speak, but he still has plenty of influence by. There's people, in this space that are continue to contend with these conversations, and I think would contend with the conversations that you're having on your channel, like with the weird Bible and the lore. Like there's a lot of that going on. So hopefully this conversation, like we're like pull you into something that's cool. And it was great to meet you, man. Any final comments today for people out there hanging out? Anything you want to give them your channel names again?
Yeah, so the main channels that I work on is the Lore Lodge, the Weird Bible, and obviously the one that you found me on is Specian now. I just, I thought it was a fun way. It stands for special interests, essentially. But I thought it'd be a fun name for it.
Well, I mispronounced it, so you can take.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. Don't worry about it. It's such a weird idea that I wasn't even sure how I would pronounce it at first. So you're totally fine.
Cool.
But no, I've greatly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for having me on. And yeah, I will definitely, I'm going to investigate some of the things that you suggested to me. And yeah, I would love to, I'll keep you in mind for other things that pop up for other conversations, because I'd love to keep this ball rolling.
Yeah, man. Well, again, a link will be to his original video that I responded to, the response to Dawkins and Peterson, and to his other channels we'll have in the description. So, dude, thank you, Aidan, for coming on and practicing some conversation craft here today.
Thank you, Christian, for having me.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for spending your time and attention with us here today on Yours Truly. We covered a lot of ground in this conversation. If something really connected with you, I invite you to leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going. I'm active in my comment section and am usually able to give a thoughtful response. Also, if you were encouraged, give the video a like. And if you, like me, curate your YouTube subscriptions and think Yours Truly would be a good addition, then go ahead and subscribe to follow along with me on this journey. Finally, if you believe this podcast endeavor is a worthy effort, you can support the channel financially through a channel membership. and be part of the Yours Truly Faithful. There'll be a link in the description. Special thanks to the Shadow Cabal already out there. And until next time, we'll see you around the corner.